This happened a few years ago. A retreat center. I was there with a friend and a group had just arrived. Man is standing at the center of it. Seemed like it was a following consisting of Indians as well as some international foreign students. Predominantly women, but there were also men. The kind of person who would say something deliberately taboo and then laughing it off. Big belly laugh. Just to prove how free the person is. Now, just another evening, there is a circle and he slaps this girl in his circle. Right across the face. So the retreat center manager steps in, asks, "Are you okay? Do you need any help?" She says, "Please do not intervene. It's between my master and me." This is what manipulation looks like. When it sounds very mystical, but it will make you believe that what just violated you was perhaps an initiation of sort. And that's what we are talking about today. Welcome to the Aligned Hearts. I am Mayoori, energy worker, healer, Sri Vidya initiate, and someone who has studied Sanskrit texts long enough to get particular about what they actually say versus what gets attributed to them. I did not arrive here in a straight line. I trained as a journalist first, then completed Samskrita women's studies degree with a master's in communications, spent 14 years inside advertising rooms at Ogilvy and Mather, Lowlantas, BBDO, and the likes of it. The combination that taught me things have never left me. How to check a source before I repeat it, and how a story gets built and sold, whether the product is a soft drink or a spiritual awakening. Before I take you into this, one small request. If this show has given you something, a way of seeing, a piece of language, a moment of feeling less alone in a question you weren't sure was allowed to be asked, subscribe to the Aligned Hearts on Spotify, YouTube, Apple Podcast, Amazon Music, wherever you're listening to this right now. It costs you 10 seconds. It genuinely changes what I'm able to build here. Every subscription tells me this work is landing, and it's what lets me keep researching properly, keep going back to the original text, keep making episodes like this, put up a production. So if you haven't already, subscribe now, then let's continue. This is a series on how Tantra, one of the most sophisticated consciousness traditions to emerge from Indian soil, became a brand. And how did it become a brand that got onto the massage table? Or something like a slap, a woman called it as an initiation. Let me tell you something that should change how you hear every tantric healer who ever posted a story. Tantra massage does not appear in any classical tantric text. Not in Vijñāna Bhairava Tantra, 112 meditation techniques given by Shiva to Shakti, not one of which involves a practitioner even touching a client in a bodywork context. Not in the Kularṇava Tantra, over 2,000 verses on liberation, initiation, and the guru-disciple relationship. Nothing about massage as a vehicle for awakening. Not in the Mahanirvana Tantra, not in the Hevajra Tantra, not in the Guhya Samaja Tantra. Contemporary research has found no references to Tantra massage in traditional tantric literature. None. Zero. The full body tantra massage as it exists today is a modern neo-tantric invention, and its origins are very much traceable with precision. We're going to look into a brief history of the genealogy because accuracy will make things very clear. I want to be precise about one thing before I trace this further, because getting it slightly wrong is exactly how this confusion spreads in the first place. I am not telling you that classical Tantra had no relationship to sexuality at all. It did in specific restricted forms in the Kaula and Vamachara branches of the Hindu Tantra, a ritual called Panchamakar, the 5 Mas that existed. Something like wine, meat, fish, parched grain, and Maithuna, ritual sexual union as the 5th. But this also got replaced by and by as an equivalent of something that would be just very symbolic. Now, this traditional ritualistic approach appears in texts like the Kularṇava Tantra and Mahanirvana Tantra. In Vajrayana Buddhism, a comparable practice exists, which is known as karma mudra found in very advanced Anuttara Yoga Tantra. But look at the conditions attached to both. Initiation by a qualified guru first, a consecrated partner, traditionally one's own initiated spouse, strict ritual timing, which was often tied to specific lunar dates, years of preparatory discipline before a practitioner was even permitted anywhere near the practice. The goal was the dissolution of the ego's boundary between purity and impurity, not pleasure, and traditionally without culminating in ordinary release. The Kularṇava Tantra itself calls this path treacherous, yes, treacherous, and warns that without a genuinely qualified guru, both the teacher and the students incur fault. This was never a technique for a paying stranger offered by an uninitiated practitioner in a rented room in an afternoon as a part of some retreat. And that is the gap. Not sex versus no sex. Restricted guru-guided initiated ritual within a specific lineage versus an open market service sold to the public with no initiation and no lineage at all. And also about the lineage, I'm going to get into the specifics of this a little bit later. Once you see that gap, you can see exactly how the modern industry was built and by. You will often hear people trying to defend Tantra, saying Tantra is not just about sex. I want to reject that sentence as well, because not just about still keeps sex on the list. It still implies sex is one of the ingredients, one of the features, bullet points of the discipline. And it's not. Tantra as a protocol, as a system of study and practice has nothing to do with sex in its actual architecture. It is a science of consciousness, energy, ritual, mantra, yantra, breath, sound, liberation. Sexuality is not a component of that architecture anymore than eating or sleeping or speaking are separate components of it. Tantra addresses the totality of embodied life, and because sexual energy is part of embodied life, Tantra has something to say about it. The way it has something to say about anger, grief, ambition, fear. That's not the same as building sex as one of the pillars into its method. The Panchamakara ritual we just discussed was restricted to one narrow branch and to fully initiated adepts. It's not an evidence that sex is a feature of Tantra. It is evidence that Tantra, because it deals with the whole of human life, so inclusive, occasionally uses sexual energy as raw material for transformation, the same way it uses wine or meat in that one ritual under extreme restriction for a tiny fraction of practitioners. It was never the method. It was never the headline nor the selling point. The danger is that the industry that got built itself on Tantra massage did not uncover a hidden sexual teaching inside the tradition. It took the one narrow, marginal, heavily restricted technique that existed anywhere in the literature, stripped away every one of its restrictions, and marketed it as the defining feature of the entire tradition. That is not a distortion of one practice. That is a distortion of what Tantra is in its totality. And it is a disservice to a several thousand-year-old body of knowledge and to the soil it came from, not to look into its actual genealogy. The story does not begin in ancient ashram. It begins in 1970s Germany and California. Here's what most people do not know or do not want to know. Rajneesh, the Osho, by the way, I'm a huge fan of that amazing man, said in his own words, and it's on record, I repeat again, I am the most anti-sex person in the whole world. If I am listened to, there will be no pornography. There will be no homosexuals. There will be no lesbians. There will be no perversions of any kind. Those who call me the sex guru are simply stupid. These are the exact words that were on record. He said this in public very emphatically. He also said those who can actually understand him can see it very clearly that he was the most anti-sex person in existence, because his whole work is to transform sexual energy into spiritual consciousness. And in the Tantra vision, he was unambiguous. Tantra is the science of transforming ordinary life into extraordinary ecstasy. It's not about indulgence, it's about going beyond, turning every experience into a doorway to the divine. This is a man whose ashram became the birthplace of Neo-Tantra. This is a thinker whose followers went on to build the tantric massage industry. And what he was actually pointing to, the transformation of energy, the transcendence of desire, the movement from sensation to consciousness, is close to the opposite of what got built in his name. To a certain extent, we can say he even anticipated it. Only those who are ready to understand will be able to understand. Otherwise, I'm going to be misunderstood. The crowd, the mass is going to misunderstand me. But I don't expect either that they should understand. I feel sorry for them. He felt sorry for them. He knew, not because he taught this as a format, because his disciples took the most provocative surface of what he said, stripped it of the rigor, stripped out the transcendence, and sold just the wrapping as the gift. It's the same mechanism as the man at the retreat center. Take something that sounds transgressive, remove the interior discipline that gives it a meaning, market the transgression, collect the following. Rajni's ashram in Pune in the 70s is where Western psychology, encounter group culture, bodywork therapy, and fragments of Sanskrita vocabulary first merged into something new, something that called itself ancient. The conflation was born there, not in Himalayan cave, not in any South Indian temple, not in any other texts which confirm it as a Shastra. It was born not from what the man said or implied, but from what his followers chose to hear. Now, if we were to trace from there on, there is one name that comes through very clearly: Margot Anand. Margot Anand was born in Paris in 1944. She holds a degree in psychology from the Sorbonne. Before she even went to India, she was already trained in gestalt therapy, bioenergetics, Reichian therapy, and massage. That her actual technical foundation, Western psychotherapy and bodywork. In 1977, she took sannyas from Osho at the ashram in Pune, and he asked her to lead his tantra groups there. That is her one direct teacher in this lineage. But remember, not a Sanskrita scholar, not an initiated Kaula guru. Osho, whose own relationship to classical tantra we've already looked at. She said, in her own words, that the body of practice she built came to her as a revelation rather than a tradition. It's okay. A lot of people get revelation, but there is also volume of justified, knowledge-backed tradition that stands very tall, that stands as a tree itself, and we cannot just uproot it just because it's inconvenient to everyone. Her own description of sky dancing tantra names its inspiration as the story of Padmasambhava and his consort Yashitsyoga in 8th century Tibet. Now, the Dakini, known as the sky dancer, that is a legend she uses as a frame. It's not a transmitted technique, and it's not the karma mudra practice we just discussed with its initiations and consecrations. She's explicit that this came to her as her own synthesis, not something handed down. So here is the actual sourcing. Her technical methods, the breath work, the movement, the chakra visualization, the body work she called de-armoring, traced to her training in Western psychology and Reichian bodywork. Her teacher of record is Osho. Her framing story is a Tibetan legend used as an evocative image, not a lineage of transmission. Her institute describes sky dancing tantra as inspired by ancient traditions of holistic spirituality and sexuality, tantric, yogic, Buddhist, Sufi, Taoists, Native American traditions, among others. But notice what the sentence does. It places 6 distinct traditions on a single list, as if they're interchangeable sources for the same body and sex content. They're not. Only specific restricted branches of Hindu and Buddhist Tantra had any ritual sexual component at all, if at all. Under the initiated conditions we just explored. Sufi practice and most Native American traditions carry no comparable sexual technique whatsoever. Listing them side by side as inspirations for a sexual bodywork method is not tracing a source, it's borrowing credibility from names the audience is already sort of familiar with and associates it with being sacred. The word inspired by is doing a lot of work in that sentence. But let's also recall inspiration is not lineage. Inspiration is not initiation. And in this case, the actual traceable inspiration is a psychology degree, a few years with one Western-facing guru and a single Tibetan legend used as a tool, poetic title. Perhaps. Now we talk about Andre Roth and the Tantric Massage School. In Germany in 1977, Andre Roth, also an ex-follower of Osho, founded what is considered the first Tantric massage school. He developed a method integrating techniques from recognized forms of massage, bioenergetics, part of yoga, and sexual therapy, which became known as Tantric healing massage. This German-developed system became the foundation for what is now the mainstream Tantric massage qualification in Europe. Let that sink in. So, the lineage of modern Tantra massage runs from Pune to California to Germany. It is roughly 50 years old and it was developed by Western and Western trained practitioners who encountered Osho's Neo-Tantra philosophy, ran it through the filters of existing body work related with psychological frameworks, packaged it with Sanskrit vocabulary. George Fuston, one of the most rigorous yoga and tantra scholars of the modern era, had a name for the result. He called it Neo-Tantrism. He said it was the watered-down version of what he felt was one of the most profound techniques, teachings ever created on Indian soil. Watered down. I think he was being still very generous. Most Western ideas about Tantra focus on sex. That this represents less than a 0.1% of the real tradition. The true goal of Tantra is the transformation of everyday life, the expansion of consciousness, not the expansion of sensation. Neo-Tantra simplified this into a technique, ignoring its deeper teachings about liberation and self-awareness. Now, this is being sold as the whole representative concept. Okay. Now, I want to take you somewhere the wellness industry never goes, into the actual language of the tradition. These texts exist, they are available, they have been translated, and they say things that should be required reading for every person sitting in a room with someone calling themselves a tantric teacher. First, the Vijñāna Bhairava Tantra on where awakening happens. The Vijñāna Bhairava Tantra is a dialogue. Shakti asks Shiva, what is your nature? How does one enter the state you abide in? Now, what Shiva gives her is 112 dharanas, which are meditation techniques, practices of pure consciousness. I'll just quote a few. In Sanskrita, there is a verse, Yaccha kinchit sukham loke, yaccha divyam mahat sukham, tat sukhasyanusarena brahmanandasya bhajanam. Whatever pleasure exists in this world, whatever great divine pleasure exists, these are all reflections of the bliss of Brahman. The true seeker recognizes the source. This is what the text says about the bliss. It points you towards the source, not towards the sensation, not towards a practitioner's hands, towards the source of consciousness itself. 112 techniques include practices of breath, sound, attention, visualization, contemplation of space. They do not include touch administered by a teacher. They include the disciple's own awareness turned inward with the guidance of teaching, not the body of a guru used as an instrument. Let's look at what Kularṇava Tantra says on what a real guru is, who he is, and who he is not. Cornerstone of the Kaula tradition. The very tradition most Neo-Tantra practitioners usually use to name drop. Here's what it actually says on the body of knowledge, what the tradition is actually for. Jnanam vina muktir nasti, na muktim vina jnanam. Tasmat jnanaparo bhutva muktirmeva samashrayet. What it actually means is, without knowledge, there is no liberation. Without liberation, no knowledge. Therefore, one who is actually committed to true knowledge must pursue the liberation itself. This is the goal, liberation, not pleasure, not awakening the body, the liberation of consciousness from its own limitation. On the confusion of physical union with spiritual union, there is one more verse we can consider. Mithuna bhasato muktir naiva na samshayaha yato mithunam evedam bandhaya na muktaye. Liberation does not come from the appearance of union. Not at all. There is no doubt about this, because this kind of union is for bondage, not liberation. The Kularṇava Tantra specifically warns its students against the pseudopaths that abound in this world. It states in unambiguous terms that the union of delight referred to in tantric practice is between the ascending Shakti and the presiding Lord above, or the container, not between the man and woman. The adepts, the practitioners who compiled this text, writing somewhere between the 10th and 12th century CE, saw this corruption coming. They named it. They built a warning directly into the scripture. The tradition anticipated Neo-Tantra by 1,000 years, and it said on false teachers, Gurupadesha vihinaha swayam mudhaha paran mohayanti kukarma nirataha kechid upadeshaya kalpate. Bereft of the instructions of the Guru and deluded in themselves, such persons delude others as well. Involved in evil actions, certain wicked ones take to preaching. And on what a genuine Guru must be, there is a reference in the Agni Purana, which says, Shuchihi Satyaha Shamopetu Dakshaha Shraddhasamanvitaha Dhyayi Jnana Samruddhyascha Tantrajnascha Guru Smritaha. Pure, truthful, tranquil, competent, endowed with faith, contemplative, rich in knowledge, and accomplished in Tantra. Such is the one remembered as a Guru. Not charismatic, not the most followed, not internationally recognized on spiritual tourism platforms. Pure, truthful, tranquil, accomplished in knowledge. These were the descriptions. And on the ethics of initiation, this is the one I want every person who has ever sat across from a so-called Tantra teacher to hear. Aparikshita shishyasya aparikshita gurorapi ubhayorapi doshah syat iti shastra nirnayah. Without proper testing, the instructing guru and the receiving disciple both commit mistakes. This is the determination of the scripture. Testing, discernment, mutual accountability. The tradition demanded these. A teacher who bypasses the period of observation, of relationship, of genuine knowing, is not being radical or advanced. He or she is violating the protocols of the very tradition he or she claims to represent. And the text says it very explicitly. What does Vijñāna Bhairava Tantra say on the sovereign self? This is one that undoes the Guru's action is beyond your understanding argument. Sarvajñah sarvakarta cha Vyapakaschit swarupatah nityoditah swayam jyotihi Nirvikalpah parashivaha, omniscient, all-doing, pervasive of the nature of pure consciousness, always arising, self-luminous, beyond conceptual constructs. This is the Supreme Shiva. This is what the Vijñāna Bhairava points you towards. Self-luminous, arising from within, not from outside, not from the hands of a teacher. The light is inside you. I know that this is something that they also sprinkle in their teachings, but they don't hold this wisdom. The part that they masquerade it with is what needs to be condemned. The tradition is a series of techniques to make you aware of a light that has or that was never extinguished. A teacher who puts himself between you and that light is not a tantric master. He's an obstacle, or even she is an obstacle, using the vocabulary of that path. Now, in the next section, we're going to look at what Buddhist Tantra says on this. The same principles are held in the Vajrayana tradition, the Tantric Buddhism of Tibet. The He-Vajra Tantra, the Guhya Samaja Tantra, Dzogchen, Mahamudra, these are the maps of consciousness, so precise that scholars and practitioners have spent lifetimes inside them. And within Vajrayana, the conduct of the guru is not a matter of interpretation. It's governed by vows. Samaya, the sacred bond between teacher and the student, is foundational. Jetsunma Khandro Rinpoche, one of the most respected Tibetan Buddhist teachers alive, responded once to the question of misconduct in the tradition. He says, study the Vinaya. It's a quality of being humble. It provides a very strict and clear code of conduct. What is allowed and not allowed. If you study it, you can identify when someone manipulates and misuses the teachings. And then students can ask questions. There is a lot of goodness in questioning. If it doesn't make sense, question it. The girl at that retreat center had been taught that her questioning was the obstacle, that doubt was the ego's resistance, that the teacher's action was always beyond what her ordinary mind could comprehend. None of that comes from Vajrayana either. None of that comes from any classical tantric text. What Tsongkhapa, one of the most important scholars in Tibetan Buddhist history, actually says is that one of the root downfalls in tantric practices is what he calls violating a wise woman who is imbued with wisdom. This refers to using a woman who has faith in Tantra but has not been properly given access to the necessary consecrations and teachings that would allow her to participate. In Tibetan Buddhist law, a root downfall is one of the most severe transgressions possible. It does not get quietly purified. It fractures the entire structure of the practice. The tradition again knew. The tradition encoded the warning. The tradition said a woman's trust in this path is not permission. Her openness is not consent. Her belief is not invitation. I just want to come back briefly to that man in the retreat center. He had no classical training, no lineage, no years of practice under someone who had years of practice under someone. What he had was this new playbook, Neo-Tantra, neo-spirituality, maybe a playbook of how to be a cult leader, perhaps. And I did not arrive at this understanding from a distance. I grew up on the teachings of the Ramakrishna Ashrama, in a home where spiritual discipline was ordinary, not exotic, not performed. And later in life, I walked into two spiritual environments that turned out to be exactly the kind of high control space we're talking about today. I'm not going to name any part of it here. What I will tell you is that I came out on the other side without becoming bitter and without walking away from the tradition itself. Because what failed me was never Tantra or Sri Vidya or spirituality as a path I had spent years believing into. What failed me was the vocabulary of this tradition that were used so generously and so cunningly. I have faced people like this in my own journey. Anyways, not just the obvious fakes, but also the ones who are with genuine power. Once you know what actual transmission feels like, it makes you quieter, more still, more of your own. You start to become more of that embodiment and less of you, who is a little you, who's the smaller version of you. Now, that girl in that retreat center, when she was defending this guy, was not protecting him out of devotion. She was protecting a story she had been given to replace her own knowing. Dismantling that story in the presence of a retreat center manager, even one genuinely trying to help, would mean dismantling everything she believed had changed her life. This is what makes this kind of abuse so effective. It does not just take your body, it takes your entire epistemology. It replaces the way you know things, and then it makes you defend that replacement. It makes you a fanatic of sort. Now, what actually went wrong in the entire process of this journey from Oriental to Westernization of Tantra? And it did not happen by accident. It did not happen in one step. It happened because the colonial encounter had already made Indian philosophy legible to the West, primarily through the lens of the exotic and the erotic. Richard Burton's translation of the Kama Sutra in 1883, a text that is not a tantric text at all, but which got permanently associated with it, established this framework. Arthur Avalon, John Woodruff translated tantric texts in the early 20th century, but within a landscape already saturated with colonial projections about Indian sexuality. By the time Rajneesh arrived, there was already a ready market of Western seekers who had been primed to believe that authentic Indian spirituality involved the liberation of the body, particularly the sexual body. Rajneesh Osho's techniques became the market they wanted. He was skilled at doing what he wanted. He somehow wove Gurdjieff with Patanjali, Zen with Vedanta, Wilhelm Reich with Shiva. What he produced was different version that got floated as Tantra in the classical sense. It felt alive in the way the West did not have on offer spiritually. It felt like a transmission, because it was of a kind, just not the kind the Sanskrit texts describe originally what Tantra is. From that orbit came an entire generation of teachers. And from those teachers came schools, institutes, certification programs. The certification programs created practitioners. The practitioners created clients, and the clients became believers. The believers sometimes became the next generation of teachers. At no point in this chain was there any recourse to the original texts. At no point did someone sit with the Kularṇava Tantra and ask, does this practice actually appear here? Does this methodology align with what this tradition actually teaches, where it comes from originally? Nobody did and nobody wanted to do. And into that gap walked every self-appointed tantric masters or tantric yoginis with a rental hall, mailing list. The problem is not with a rental hall and a mailing list. Let me be very clear about it. It is with the distortion of a practice. Do not use the word Tantra in place of sensuality, sexuality, awakening of any of the sensual practices. And I want to end this episode with some more conclusive thoughts. What the Vijñāna Bhairava Tantra actually produces when practiced properly is this: Saswaswarupe sada vartate. Swaswarupe, the power of knowing, always abides in one's own true nature. And I guarantee it is not available in any of those Tantra teacher trainings. It abides in you. If you have had an experience in a so-called tantric space that left you confused, violated, smaller than what when you entered, I want you to hear this. You were not tested. You were not too rigid for that teaching. The tradition did not ask for what was taken from you. And if you're looking for the real thing, it's there. It's in the texts, it's in some practices, it's in some people. It's in the lineages that have held it carefully for a very long time with rigorous ethics. It's more demanding, more precise, more transformational than anything, and less glamorous than anything on a retreat center menu. And it begins always with the teacher who sends you back to yourself, more whole, more awake, more sovereign. Stay discerning, stay sovereign. The part of you that questions is also the part of Shiva that is guiding you. Thank you for staying in tune with me, with aligned hearts, with Mayoori. See you in the next episode.